Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to The Drowsy Historian, where we tuck you into bed with tales so grim, bizarre and fascinating that you'll either fall asleep or stay awake questioning why humanity ever thought some of this was a good idea. Tonight, we're marching straight into the mud-soaked, disease-ridden and soul-crushing world of medieval sieges. Forget the heroic battlefield charges you see in movies. Real war in the Middle Ages often meant sitting around, starving, waiting, and hoping your side didn't die of dysentery before the enemy ran out of bread. Sieges weren't quick, they weren't glorious, and they certainly weren't clean. They were the ultimate endurance test for soldiers, peasants, nobles, and anyone unlucky enough to be trapped behind stone walls. So, settle in, pull your blanket up, and let's step into the first chapter of our night-long tour through the horrors of a medieval siege. Let's set the scene. Imagine you're a soldier in the 13th century. You've been marched miles away from home, promised plunder and glory if you serve loyally, and what you find instead is a gigantic fortress looming over you like a stone middle finger from the past. Its walls are thick enough to laugh at your puny arrows, its gates bristling with iron, and its defenders peering down at you with the kind of smugness that only comes from being on the right side of stone. You realize very quickly that storming those walls is suicide, so the brilliant minds in charge tell you to do the obvious. Wait. Yes. Medieval warfare at its finest wasn't a clash of steel, but a waiting contest, one side praying their stomachs hold out longer than the other. That was the true battlefield: patience, boredom, and hunger. But let's not glorify the defenders too quickly. Life inside the walls was hardly a medieval spa retreat. At first, yes, spirits are high. The Lord struts around, declaring that his walls have never been breached. The soldiers cheer, women gather water, and markets open with some normalcy. But give it a month or two, and the cracks begin to show. The grain stores shrink, the meat spoils, and suddenly people who once prided themselves on fine bread are gnawing on bark and boiling leather straps just to get a meal. Rats become a delicacy. Cats vanish mysteriously. And if you were really unlucky, famine pushed people to eat each other. Chroniclers whisper about this with the kind of hushed disgust that makes you wonder how many whispers were actually eyewitness reports. It wasn't heroism. It was survival at its ugliest. Now look back at the besieging army. They weren't exactly thriving either. Thousands of men cramped into tents, sleeping on damp ground, sharing lice with their neighbours like it was some twisted medieval friendship bracelet. The food outside the walls wasn't much better. Supply lines were long, unreliable, and often raided. If you were lucky, your ration was stale bread, crawling with insects, and salted meat so tough it could break a tooth. If you were unlucky, you went hungry while staring at the fortress that seemed to mock you with its sturdy defiance. Soldiers grumbled, mercenaries deserted, and disease spread faster than any army could march. In many sieges, more men died in the attacker's camp than behind the defender's walls, courtesy of dysentery, typhus, and other invisible killers. So much for glorious conquest. Let's not forget the smell. Sieges stank. Imagine thousands of men relieving themselves in trenches, dumping waste near camp, corpses piling up because no one wanted to risk carrying them too far from safety. The defenders didn't fare better. Their latrines overflowed, their streets filled with filth, and disease spread through the close-packed towns like fire through dry hay. When we call medieval sieges endurance tests, we don't just mean patience. We mean enduring smells, sounds, sights and tastes that would make even the bravest knight weep into his rusty helmet. And since we're trying to make this a little personal, let me give you two faces to follow in this misery. On the attacker's side, meet Thomas, a young villager drafted into his lord's army. He knows little of war beyond what songs told him, and those songs never mentioned how boring, cold, and disgusting war actually was. His days blur together, guard duty, stale rations, and the occasional thrill of not dying when an arrow whizzes past. He scratches at his flea bites, and wonders if glory is really worth smelling like death. Inside the walls, meet Marjorie, a weaver's wife. Her loom stands silent now because there's no market for cloth, when no one has food. She spends her days rationing scraps for her children, trying to quiet their hollow cries at night, and wondering how long before she has nothing left to give them. Thomas and Marjorie will never meet, but they represent the real face of siege warfare. The ordinary powerless people crushed between stone and steel. Here's the cruel irony of all this. Walls were supposed to protect. Lords built castles to keep their people safe, to project power, and to symbolize stability. Yet in a siege, those same walls became prisons. They locked civilians inside, cut them off from supplies, and turned every street into a slow march towards starvation. And for the attackers, those walls mocked every effort. Throw your arrows, bring your ladders, scream your war cries. None of it mattered when the stone remained unmoved. Siege warfare was less about heroism and more about stubbornness, and quite often, both sides lost more than they ever gained. Critics of the time didn't need hindsight to see the futility. Chroniclers wrote with weary sarcasm about endless sieges where nothing seemed to happen, where months of suffering ended in either surrender or an anticlimactic truce. The irony wasn't lost on them. Kings would gamble fortunes, peasants would lose their lives, and after all the blood and rot, the result was often a simple agreement that could have been made before thousands starved. But such is human pride. Better to let entire towns rot than be seen as weak. That, perhaps, is the most medieval fact of all. So here in Chapter 1, we've set the stage, walls towering, armies waiting, famine spreading, and despair gnawing at everyone equally. This wasn't the battlefield of shining armour and gallant charges. It was the grinding misery of attrition. Thomas scratches at his flea bites, Marjorie whispers empty promises to her children, and the walls loom silently, knowing they are both saviour and executioner. Welcome to the endurance test of a siege, where victory belonged not to the strongest, but to those who could endure the longest stink of rotting humanity. If you've ever been stuck in a traffic jam that stretches for miles, you already understand something about medieval siege warfare. Both are long, boring, and filled with desperate people wishing they were anywhere else. The only difference is that in a traffic jam you're not usually worried about being pelted with rocks or having your last loaf of bread stolen by rats. That, however, was the daily reality of the siege. Walls weren't just stone barriers. They were endurance machines, designed less to repel flashy assaults, and more to test the patience of the human beings on both sides, until somebody finally broke. Think about it. When you picture war, you probably imagine charging cavalry, clashing swords, and banners flying in the wind. But a siege? It was more like a passive-aggressive staring contest. The defenders huddled behind their stone fortresses, while the attackers camped outside, drumming their fingers and waiting for hunger to do their work. The cruel part was that both sides often knew exactly what was coming. Defenders stocked up on grain and salted fish. Attackers hauled wagons of supplies and siege engines. Everyone pretended to be ready. But deep down they understood this was less about strength and more about who could endure the longest stretch of hell without collapsing first. And endurance, as medieval people discovered time and again, rarely looked heroic. Let's talk about the math of misery for a moment. A fortress of, say, 500 civilians and a couple hundred soldiers might have granaries filled with wheat to last 6 months. That sounds decent, until you remember that medieval record-keeping wasn't exactly flawless. Grain spoiled, rats feasted on stores, and lords sometimes skimmed off supplies for their own luxury while peasants starved. On the outside, an attacking army of 10,000 men could, in theory, draw from the countryside. But what happens when the countryside is already burned to ash? You get hungry soldiers raiding each other's tents, stealing what little remains, and wondering why their noble commanders are still eating roasted meat under silk canopies, while they gnaw on hard bread that tastes like chalk. Siege warfare, at its heart, wasn't about noble sacrifice. It was about who got cheated by hunger first. Of course, patience didn't mean idleness. Both sides engaged in little games of cruelty. Defenders might toss rotting animal carcasses over the walls, not as projectiles, but as invitations for disease. Attackers built crude machines to lob flaming barrels of pitch, or, if they were feeling especially theatrical, the severed heads of captured prisoners. Nothing screams, "We're winning." Quite like your cousin's decapitated skull sailing through your bedroom window at breakfast. Siege warfare was as much psychological as physical, a drawn-out theatre of intimidation. And the audience, unfortunately, was trapped civilians who had no choice but to watch their world collapse one grotesque act at a time. Now, let's check in with our two reluctant companions. Outside the walls, Thomas the conscript has learned the truth about siege life. Most of his time is spent waiting, digging latrines, and cursing the nobles who dragged him here. He hears rumours that the lord commanding them is in negotiations with another lord about payment, because, let's not kid ourselves, many sieges were fought less for honour than for outstanding rent bills or inheritance squabbles. Thomas doesn't care about the politics. All he knows is that his stomach growls at night and the lice on his scalp are thriving like they own the place. Meanwhile, inside the fortress, Marjorie the weaver's wife has grown weary of boiling bark into soup. Her children beg her for bread she no longer has, and she wonders whether the lord feasting in the castle's great hall is aware that half the town's children look like skeletons. Spoiler, he probably knows, but nobles weren't famous for empathy. Let's pause and appreciate the absurdity here. Two ordinary people, Thomas outside, Marjorie inside, suffering because two wealthy elites wanted to prove a point about land, honour, or some insult delivered a decade earlier at a feast. Thousands of men, women and children endured hunger, disease and death, so that a handful of nobles could settle their disputes in the most inefficient way possible. Imagine someone today suing their neighbour, but instead of going to court, they starve an entire town for 6 months just to make a point. That was medieval logic at work, brutal, wasteful and laced with vanity. And then, of course, there were the critics, even in their own time. Chroniclers often recorded sieges with a kind of sarcastic weariness. The army sat and waited, one might write, followed by 3 paragraphs describing who died of plague that week. They didn't exactly shower praise on these endurance contests. And why would they? When all is said and done, siege warfare rarely delivered the decisive, heroic victory kings bragged about. More often, one side gave up, not because the walls fell, but because their stomachs did. And yet, century after century, men returned to the same grim test, as if repeating the same slow torture was somehow a mark of civilization. So in this first chapter, what do we really see? We see that medieval warfare wasn't a stage for bravery. It was a grim lottery of endurance. We see walls that were both saviour and prison. We see soldiers outside who died not from arrows but from diarrhea, and civilians inside who shrank day by day until their bones showed through their skin. We see Thomas scratching at lice and cursing his lord. We see Marjorie staring at her empty pot, pretending bark soup tastes like bread. And through it all we see the absurd persistence of human pride, which insisted that suffering on this scale was preferable to compromise. That's the ugly truth of walls versus armies. They weren't symbols of noble defiance or military brilliance. They were monuments to stubbornness, grinding entire populations through hunger, disease and despair, just to prove a point. If the medieval world excelled at anything, it wasn't chivalry or glory. It was suffering, spread thin and shared equally between those inside and those outside the walls. And this, my sleepy friends, was only the beginning. Chapter 2, The Waiting Game. If war is supposed to be fast and furious, then medieval sieges were its exact opposite, slow, suffocating, and so mind-numbingly dull that you almost wished an arrow would hit you just to break the monotony. They weren't battles in the modern sense. They were long pauses in history where thousands of men and women sat around waiting for something, anything to happen. And when something finally did, it was usually disease, famine, or despair, not the glorious cavalry charge people like to imagine. If the battlefield was a stage for action, the siege was a theatre of boredom, one in which endurance and misery became the starring roles. Let's start with the attackers. Outside the fortress walls, Thomas the unlucky conscript has settled into a routine so tedious it makes watching paint dry sound like an adventure. Each day he wakes up on the damp ground, pulls himself from a flea-ridden blanket, and prepares for another round of waiting. Guard duty at the palisade, digging ditches, repairing tents, fetching water, all while keeping one eye on the walls above where defenders occasionally lob down an arrow or two just to remind the besiegers they're still alive. And in between these bursts of activity, nothing. Days stretched endlessly into one another, marked only by the grumbling of stomachs and the growing stench of unwashed men living too close together. Siege camps were less military might and more medieval refugee centres, except everyone was armed and cranky. Inside the walls, Marjorie the weaver's wife faced her own version of waiting hell. The town, once bustling with markets and noise, grew eerily silent as food dwindled and fear settled in. Bakers closed their shops, wells ran murkier with each passing day, and people began measuring their lives not in months or seasons, but in meals left before starvation. Marjorie used to count time by the completion of a weaving project. Now she counts by how many bowls of thin gruel remain for her children. Her husband, once proud of providing for his family, has joined other townsfolk in scraping moss from walls and weeds from streets to make something resembling food. Time inside a siege was not marked by the church bells, but by the slow erosion of dignity. And here lies the cruel brilliance of the siege. It didn't just attack walls, it attacked minds. Weeks turned into months, and the boredom was punctuated not by action, but by dread. Imagine being Thomas, staring at the same stretch of fortress every single day, praying for something to change, knowing it won't. Or imagine Marjorie, watching her children grow thinner, knowing that every bite of food she gives them is one less she'll eat herself. Waiting was the true weapon. Hunger gnawed slowly, fear crept in, and time became an enemy more relentless than any soldier. The monotony could break even the strongest wills. Soldiers deserted when the boredom grew unbearable. Defenders slipped out at night, risking capture, just to escape the suffocating silence of stone walls. And for those who stayed, the waiting game was spiced up with the occasional horror. Attackers might catapult diseased corpses into the city, filling the air with the stench of death. Defenders might retaliate with taunts, hanging prisoners over the walls to show how little they cared. Yet these dramatic gestures were just small bursts in a long, slow grind. 90% of the time, nothing happened except suffering. And if you think commanders fared any better, think again. Kings and lords sat in their tents, writing letters, complaining about supplies, and trying to hold together armies that wanted nothing more than to go home. Chronicles are filled with sarcastic notes about sieges lasting years, with both sides wasting fortunes only to end in treaties that could have been signed before the first stone was thrown. But pride was a stubborn master. Better to let your people rot for months than admit you weren't strong enough to storm the walls. In many ways, medieval lords were the original masters of wasting time and lives in equal measure. Criticism of this wasn't rare, even then. Chroniclers often wrote with barely concealed irritation, describing sieges as long, fruitless, and miserable. You can almost hear their sighs in the parchment. They weren't thrilled to spend months documenting who died of plague and who boiled their shoes for soup. And here's the thing, they weren't wrong. Siege warfare was less about military genius and more about stubborn endurance. It was a waiting game where everyone lost something, health, dignity, or sanity, long before any walls finally crumbled. The real tragedy of this waiting was the waste. Entire communities put on hold, lives reduced to counting crumbs of bread, soldiers wasting months for battles that never came. Thomas wastes away in boredom and hunger outside the walls. Marjorie wastes away in despair inside them, both trapped in a limbo created by men who saw honour in stubbornness and nothing in mercy. This was not heroism, it was cruelty disguised as strategy. So when we think about medieval sieges as the ultimate endurance test, it wasn't just the strength of stone walls or the might of armies. It was the sheer, grinding ability to sit, suffer, and wait while life drained away. Waiting became the battlefield, silence became the weapon, and despair became the victor. And this, my friends, was only the beginning of the long test that defined medieval war. The strangest thing about a medieval siege was how little of it looked like war and how much of it looked like a very unpleasant camping trip mixed with a slow-motion famine. You would expect clashes of steel and fire every day, but more often than not, the siege was defined by inactivity. The boredom was its own kind of violence, dragging men into despair without ever drawing a blade. Imagine Thomas, our unfortunate conscript outside the walls, staring at the same stretch of stone for the 100th time, watching birds circle lazily overhead and realizing those birds are probably eating better than he is. Siege warfare was less a test of courage than a marathon of misery, and many men failed long before the walls did. For the besieging army, waiting meant improvising ways to keep from collapsing into chaos. The commanders organized drills to keep soldiers sharp, but you can only march in circles so many times before the excitement wears off. Dice games became a favorite pastime, as did drinking, but both brought their own dangers. Gambling often ended in fights, and drunken brawls sometimes killed more men than enemy arrows. Discipline was fragile, held together by fear of punishment and the vague promise of loot once the city finally surrendered. Yet men deserted regularly, slipping away under cover of night. For every deserter caught and executed as an example, 2 more quietly disappeared. After all, why starve in a muddy field when you could at least starve at home in familiar surroundings? Meanwhile, inside the fortress, boredom had teeth. Marjorie and her fellow townsfolk lived in a prison where every day felt the same. Lines at the well, arguments over dwindling supplies, children crying from hunger. The silence of the streets grew heavier with each passing week, broken only by the occasional clash when defenders rushed to the walls to repel a probing attack. But even those moments of violence were brief, and then the waiting resumed. Medieval life was already a grind of toil and scarcity. A siege simply magnified the suffering until every breath felt like an act of survival. The longer the wait dragged on, the stranger and more desperate the behaviour became. In besieged towns, superstition flourished. People prayed to saints, staged processions with holy relics, and sometimes blamed supposed witches or traitors for their misfortune. Accusations flew as fast as arrows, and scapegoats were punished to make the starving masses feel they had some control. Outside, soldiers grew restless and cruel. They raided nearby villages, not just for food, but for the sheer distraction of violence. Peasants living within miles of a siege had the worst of both worlds, raided by attackers, abandoned by defenders, and left to watch their homes burn because 2 lords wanted to prove whose stone wall was stronger. And yet, despite all this suffering, neither side wanted to give in. Lords valued honour above human lives, and commanders treated the endurance of their troops as a measure of strength. The irony is painful. Men and women perished slowly, while their rulers sat comfortably, declaring that surrender would be shameful. Critics at the time pointed out this hypocrisy, though usually in hushed tones, to avoid losing their heads. Some chroniclers wrote almost with sarcasm, noting how armies valiantly sat for months while disease accomplished what their weapons could not. It was medieval satire disguised as history, but the message is clear. Siege warfare was an absurd waste of life masquerading as strategy. Even attempts to break the monotony were cruel. Attackers built siege engines, massive towers and catapults that took weeks to construct, only for defenders to set them on fire with a single flaming arrow. Defenders staged sudden sallies, rushing out of the gates to torch enemy supplies. But such moments were rare and costly. Most of the time, these so-called military maneuvers amounted to little more than bursts of activity that briefly distracted from the crushing reality of waiting. And when those distractions ended, the silence returned, heavier than before. Let's not forget the role of disease in this waiting game. The longer armies sat in one place, the worse sanitation became. Outside the walls, latrines overflowed and water sources grew fouled. Inside, waste piled up in narrow streets and rats thrived. The Black Death famously turned sieges into nightmares when entire garrisons died before a single wall was breached. In some cases, armies abandoned their efforts entirely, not because they were defeated in combat, but because they had simply rotted away in their own filth. Nothing demonstrates the futility of waiting better than an entire army retreating without ever storming the walls, leaving behind a graveyard of unmarked pits and wasted lives. And here's where the real criticism cuts deepest. Siege warfare wasn't just cruel, it was inefficient. Months of waiting, countless lives lost, all for outcomes that were often anticlimactic. Many sieges ended in negotiated surrenders, with defenders allowed to walk free after starving for months. Others ended when attackers simply gave up, exhausted by their own suffering. The spectacle of waiting achieved little beyond proving that human stubbornness could outlast common sense. And yet, kings and nobles kept repeating this endurance test century after century, as if convinced that wasting time and lives was the height of strategy. For Thomas, the days blend into one another, his body weaker, his patience thinner. For Marjorie, each morning feels heavier than the last, her children quieter not because they've stopped crying, but because they no longer have the strength. Both are trapped in this endless game, pawns in a contest of endurance between men who cared more for honour than humanity. The waiting game was not just about who could last longest, it was about who could survive the slow erosion of body, mind, and dignity. And in that sense, no one ever truly won. So when we look at sieges today, it's tempting to imagine them as tests of military brilliance or architectural might. But the truth is far darker. They were tests of endurance, where boredom, hunger, and disease played the leading roles. They were drawn-out tragedies, where people wasted away not for glory, but for the pride of rulers who rarely suffered the consequences themselves. Waiting wasn't just part of the siege, it was the siege. And it left scars on every man, woman and child, unlucky enough to be trapped in its grasp. Chapter 3. Starvation as a Weapon. If the sword was the weapon of choice for the battlefield, then hunger was the weapon of the siege. It needed no training, no sharpened blade, no polished armour. Hunger was the silent general, patient and ruthless, cutting down defenders one hollow belly at a time. And make no mistake, starvation was not an accident of siege warfare, it was the plan. When commanders looked up at the walls of a fortress, too high to climb, too thick to smash, they often shrugged and said, "Let hunger do the work." It was cheaper, safer, and, in a way that only medieval logic could admire, far more cruel. Inside the walls, the first weeks were manageable. Granaries were opened, salted meat distributed, and bread baked. But time was not on their side. Wheat rotted, meat spoiled, and rats had a nasty habit of helping themselves to the very food that people were trying to save. Soon enough, the hierarchy of meals began. The wealthy and the lords ate first and best, of course. Nobles sat in their stone halls, chewing what remained of salted pork and pretending that everything was under control. Down in the streets, people like Marjorie the weaver's wife discovered what rationing really meant. Tiny scraps of bread, thin soup stretched with water, and the occasional rat if one was unlucky enough to be caught wandering too slowly through the alleys. The stomach doesn't lie. And as the weeks dragged on, everyone could see the truth written on the bodies around them. Faces grew hollow, cheeks sunken, eyes lifeless. Even children stopped crying after a while, not because the suffering ended, but because they no longer had the strength to make noise. Outside the walls, Thomas the conscript fared little better. While the defenders starved behind stone, the attackers often starved in their tents. Supply lines were a joke at the best of times, and besieging armies sometimes stripped the surrounding countryside bare within weeks. Peasants, unlucky enough to live nearby, had their food stolen, their homes burned, and their livestock slaughtered to feed an army that was itself still perpetually hungry. Soldiers grumbled, mercenaries demanded higher pay for enduring hunger, and commanders handed out promises of loot once the siege ended. Promises, as Thomas soon learned, did little to fill the stomach. When the true famine set in, things became desperate. Historical accounts describe scenes that sound more like nightmares than reality. During the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, starving defenders supposedly ate leather belts, grass, and even boiled shoes. During the siege of Rochester in 1215, King John's men famously hurled the carcasses of dead animals into the castle, tainting what little food the defenders had left. At Montsegur, besieged Cathars resorted to eating anything remotely edible, from weeds to their own horses, until the animals that had once carried knights into battle became thin soup shared among starving families. It was desperation distilled into daily life. Starvation had a social dimension too. It revealed the ugly truth about hierarchy. While peasants clawed at scraps, lords often held private banquets behind castle walls, convincing themselves that morale was more important than fairness. Bread was baked for the noble table, even as townsfolk chewed bark and roots. The hypocrisy was not lost on anyone. Chronicles from multiple sieges describe riots breaking out inside cities, the poor rising against their supposed protectors because they refused to starve quietly while their masters dined. Hunger was not just a physical torment, it was a spark for rebellion. Siege warfare turned every fortress into a pressure cooker, and when food ran out, it was not always the attackers who posed the greatest danger, but one's own neighbours. The cruel genius of starvation as a weapon lay in its invisibility. No dramatic charges, no heroic clashes, just the quiet, grinding collapse of human dignity. A defender could stand bravely at the walls one week and be too weak to lift a sword the next. And hunger did not just claim bodies, it claimed minds. Malnutrition led to madness. Some accounts describe defenders hallucinating, wandering aimlessly, or committing acts of violence against their own kin for a mouthful of food. There were even darker tales, whispered but persistent, of cannibalism within besieged cities. Chroniclers often noted these with outrage, perhaps exaggerating to shock their readers, but the fact remains that famine pushed humans to the edge of morality. The ultimate insult of siege warfare was not death by sword, but the slow unravelling of humanity by hunger. And of course, outside the walls, starvation claimed its victims too. Armies sometimes disbanded not because they lost battles, but because their stomachs gave out. Men deserted in droves when supplies failed, leaving their commanders furious and helpless. In some cases, attackers starved faster than the defenders, their grand siege collapsing into retreat and shame. Nothing undermines the pomp of war like an army scattering, not from fear of arrows, but from the universal truth that no one fights well on an empty stomach. Criticism of this method has echoed through history, and rightly so. Starvation as a weapon was efficient, but it was cowardly in its cruelty. It targeted civilians more than soldiers, the weak more than the strong. Commanders celebrated victories when cities surrendered from famine, but what they truly achieved was the mass suffering of the powerless. It was less a triumph of strategy and more a testament to the arrogance of rulers who valued land and pride above human life. If war is supposed to be about strength, then famine revealed just how weak humanity could be when pride disguised itself as necessity. So here we leave Thomas and Marjorie once more. Thomas hungry in his tent, chewing stale bread and dreaming of meat. Marjorie staring at her children's sunken faces, praying for a miracle that never comes. Neither chose this endurance test, yet both were trapped in it, paying the price for someone else's ambition. Hunger was the siege master, and it ruled without mercy. It demanded patience, stole dignity, and devoured hope. No matter how thick the walls or how sharp the swords, hunger always won in the end. If patience was the first tool of a siege, then famine was the hammer that finally cracked open even the proudest walls. Hunger worked slowly but relentlessly, a weapon no soldier could parry and no fortress could keep out. You could raise your shields against arrows, hide behind battlements to avoid catapults, even pray that saints would stop flaming projectiles. But no amount of prayer or masonry could stop the gnawing emptiness in the belly. And that is why, in the cruel arithmetic of medieval warfare, commanders often chose to wait. A starving city was easier to conquer than a defiant one, and if a few thousand peasants had to waste away so a noble could claim victory, well, history shows us most nobles slept just fine. Starvation wasn't just about food, it was about morale. Hunger eroded not only the body but the spirit. Soldiers who once stood proudly at the walls grew weaker by the day, their hands trembling as they tried to notch arrows, their legs failing beneath the weight of armour. Civilians, too, withered. Once bustling marketplaces turned silent, taverns shut down, and laughter disappeared. Hunger replaced every sound with silence, every smell with decay. A starving city was a quiet one, and quiet was the enemy of hope. When the streets emptied, when children no longer played, when the bakers' ovens went cold, those were the true signals of collapse. Let's not romanticize this. The diets of the starving were grotesque experiments in desperation. Chronicles tell of leather boiled into broth, horses slaughtered not for battle but for stew, dogs and cats disappearing into pots, rats becoming as valuable as chickens. In the siege of Paris in 1870, centuries after the Middle Ages, but proof of famine's persistence, citizens famously ate zoo animals. In medieval sieges, it was no different, only less documented, because chroniclers often found the details too disgusting to record. What we do know is enough. People scraped moss from stones, boiled weeds into soup, and gnawed bones long after the marrow was gone. Some accounts even mention parchment boiled for sustenance. Imagine eating your own library one page at a time. And yes, we have to mention the darkest element, cannibalism. Chroniclers almost relished writing about it, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes whispering, but the stories are there. During the siege of Jerusalem, there were rumours of mothers eating their own children. At other sieges, corpses were not buried, but consumed. Whether these were isolated horrors or widespread reality, the fact that famine drove people to such acts speaks volumes. Hunger stripped away the veneer of civilization until nothing remained but raw survival. And still, outside the walls, the besieging army waited, satisfied that starvation was doing their job for them. Of course, starvation didn't play favourites. The besieging soldiers themselves often faced hunger, especially if supply lines stretched too far, or if the defenders managed to burn fields before retreating. Thomas, our unlucky conscript, learned this quickly. The bread he chewed was stale, hard, and often crawling with bugs, but the alternative was nothing at all. He dreamt of roasted meat while gnawing on a crust so sharp it cut his gums. His commander promised that once the fortress surrendered, loot would flow and bellies would be full. But Thomas knew promises didn't taste like food, and so he endured, waiting for a feast that might never come. Marjorie, trapped inside, faced her own torment. She boiled roots until they turned into bitter paste, rationed crumbs among her children, and ignored the growls of her own stomach. She hated the lord who still feasted in the castle, hated the enemy outside who starved them, and hated the stone walls that turned her home into a coffin. Yet she endured, not because she believed in victory, but because the human body clings to life long after the soul wants to give up. That, perhaps, is the true endurance of a siege. Not strength, not courage, but the stubborn refusal of the body to die quickly. The hypocrisy of famine warfare is glaring. Commanders called it strategy, but in truth it was cruelty by convenience. Why risk your soldiers storming the walls when hunger could do the killing for you? Why waste arrows when bread was deadlier? And yet, those who suffered most were never the ones who made the decisions. Lords in their stone halls kept food for themselves, while peasants died in the streets. Kings congratulated themselves for capturing starving cities, as if empty bellies were evidence of military genius. In reality, it was laziness masked as cleverness, a strategy that punished the weak to protect the pride of the strong. And here's the irony: famine didn't even guarantee success. In some sieges, the defenders held out long enough for reinforcements to arrive, turning the tables on the starving besiegers. Other times, the attackers grew too hungry first, retreating in shame while the defenders staggered out, still alive despite months of misery. Starvation was a gamble, one that wasted lives regardless of outcome. If the attackers won, thousands of civilians lay dead. If the defenders survived, the attackers often left behind a trail of corpses from their own camps. Either way, hunger was the true victor, mocking both sides for their stubbornness. Critics, even in the medieval world, recognized this futility. Chroniclers wrote of sieges dragging on so long that entire seasons passed, armies dwindled, and nothing was gained but empty land and ruined lives. They questioned why kings spent fortunes and years on wars that could have been settled with less suffering. And while they couched their words carefully, a thread of sarcasm runs through the pages. Noble pride turned into famine theatre, with peasants forced to play the unwilling actors. You can almost hear the chroniclers muttering, "All this death for what? A wall? A title? A scrap of land?" So, when we talk about medieval sieges as endurance tests, starvation was the cruelest measure. It was not the clash of knights or the roar of catapults that decided the outcome, but the sound of empty stomachs and the silence of children too weak to cry. Thomas gnawed his stale crust. Marjorie shared her last crumb, and both wondered how long before the waiting ended, not with victory, but with surrender to hunger. That is the quiet truth of medieval warfare. Glory starved long before people did. Chapter 5. Machines of Destruction. For all the talk of patience and starvation, medieval warfare still had its toys. And by toys, I mean hulking wooden monsters designed to hurl rocks, fire, or occasionally dead cows at your enemies. Because if waiting for people to die of hunger wasn't fast enough, there was always the option of smashing their walls to dust. Siege engines were the medieval version of heavy artillery, impressive to look at, terrifying to face, and often just as dangerous to the people operating them as to the enemy. They were built with sweat, wood, rope, and a healthy disregard for physics, yet they changed the face of warfare by making the unbreakable suddenly breakable. Let's start with the classic, the trebuchet. If you've ever seen a giant wooden structure with a long arm hurling boulders through the air, that's the trebuchet, the superstar of medieval siege engines. Unlike the smaller catapults, the trebuchet used counterweights, massive stones or heavy boxes filled with lead, to swing an arm and launch projectiles with astonishing force. Some could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds over 200 yards. Imagine standing on a wall, feeling smug about its thickness, only to watch a boulder the size of a cartwheel smash into it, shaking the very stone beneath your feet. The trebuchet wasn't subtle. It was medieval brute force at its finest. Of course, medieval commanders didn't stop at rocks. Why waste the opportunity for psychological warfare? Chronicles gleefully describe trebuchets launching flaming barrels of pitch, dismembered body parts, or entire rotting corpses over castle walls. Disease became a payload, fire became a spectacle, and fear became the real weapon. Marjorie, trapped inside her fortress, would have watched as her city's defenders scrambled to put out fires or buried the stinking remains of whatever horror had just landed in the marketplace. For Thomas outside the walls, building and operating a trebuchet wasn't glamorous either. It took dozens of men to haul ropes, adjust weights, and risk splinters the size of daggers if the contraption snapped mid-swing, which, unsurprisingly, it often did. Then there were siege towers, giant rolling structures designed to bring soldiers level with battlements. Picture a massive wooden box on wheels, several stories tall, creaking forward across uneven ground, while defenders rained arrows and fire down upon it. These towers were feats of carpentry and stubbornness, clad in wet hides to resist flames, filled with ladders and platforms for soldiers to pour out onto the walls. In theory, brilliant. In practice, they often got stuck in the mud, caught fire anyway, or collapsed under their own weight before reaching the enemy. Thomas probably cursed every time he was ordered to push one forward, knowing full well that the defenders had barrels of burning oil waiting. Siege towers were like the medieval version of a Kickstarter project. They looked great in concept, but often failed spectacularly in execution. Battering rams, on the other hand, were as simple as they were effective. A giant log, suspended by chains or carried by dozens of men, pounded against gates until wood splintered. They were covered with wooden shelters called sows to protect the men inside from arrows and boiling oil. The defenders, naturally, developed their own tricks, dropping heavy stones, pouring hot sand that seeped into armor and cooked skin, or setting the ram itself on fire. The battle between ram and gate was a noisy, brutal contest of endurance. Imagine Thomas sweating inside one of those shelters, the sound of timber cracking above him, the stench of smoke filling the air, while Marjorie listened from inside the walls, praying the gate would hold. And then there were mining operations, less flashy, more terrifying. Attackers dug tunnels beneath castle walls, propped up by wooden beams, and then set those beams on fire to collapse the tunnels, bringing sections of the wall crashing down. It was a strategy as claustrophobic as it was effective. Digging underground in near darkness with the threat of cave-ins and suffocation was hardly glamorous work, and defenders weren't passive. They dug countermines, tunneling in the opposite direction to intercept enemy diggers. Imagine the horror of breaking through soil into another tunnel and finding yourself face to face with enemy miners. Battles underground were fought with picks, torches, and desperation. The air filled with smoke and dust until everyone either suffocated or retreated. This was siege warfare at its most nightmarish. The sheer scale of effort behind these machines is staggering. Entire forests were chopped down to build them. Thousands of men laboured for weeks, and all for a device that might fail spectacularly in the first use. Chroniclers often mocked the wastefulness, noting how lords poured resources into machines that collapsed in the mud, while disease and hunger quietly killed more enemies than the fanciest engine ever did. It's hard not to see the irony. All this wood, all this labour, and still more sieges ended in surrender from starvation than in glorious wall smashing. Yet commanders loved their machines, perhaps because they looked impressive and gave the illusion of action in a situation otherwise defined by waiting. Marjorie, for her part, hated them. Every crash of a boulder shook her bones. Every flaming projectile threatened her home. Every creaking tower creeping forward filled her with dread. Thomas hated them too, though for different reasons. He sweated and strained to build them, cursed when they failed, and often wondered if all the effort was worth it when his friends were still dying from dysentery in the camp. Both of them saw the truth. Machines of destruction were less about efficiency and more about spectacle, more about convincing everyone that progress was being made when, in reality, both sides were still rotting slowly in mud and hunger. So, were siege engines impressive? Absolutely. They were feats of medieval engineering, proof of human creativity under duress. Were they effective? Sometimes, but often at a cost so high it seemed ridiculous. And were they necessary? Not always, since hunger and disease usually won the day anyway. Siege engines were like medieval theatre, loud, dramatic, and meant to impress. But behind the spectacle lay the same grim endurance test. The walls might crumble eventually, but by then so had the bodies and spirits of everyone involved. The medieval imagination had no shortage of ways to break walls. If brute force didn't work, they invented something bigger, heavier, or stranger. Siege warfare was as much about engineering bravado as it was about patience, though whether that bravado achieved anything is another matter entirely. When starvation and disease weren't moving fast enough, commanders ordered their carpenters and engineers to work miracles out of wood, rope, and stubbornness. Sometimes it worked spectacularly. Other times, the grand machines of war collapsed in the mud, leaving soldiers cursing and chroniclers quietly smirking as they scribbled down yet another tale of wasted effort. Take the trebuchet, for instance, the undisputed diva of siege engines. Chronicles gush about their power, some claiming they could launch stones weighing over 300 pounds. Castles once thought invincible found themselves trembling as boulders smashed into towers with sickening force. During the Siege of Acre in 1189, massive trebuchets pounded the walls for months, showering the city in rubble and terror. Yet, despite their destructive power, trebuchets were notoriously fickle. They required precise counterweights, carefully woven ropes, and skilled crews. A miscalculation could send a projectile veering off course, sometimes back into the besieger's own camp. Imagine Thomas standing in line for his ration of stale bread when suddenly a boulder, meant for the enemy, crashes into his own latrine. Not exactly the glorious moment he signed up for. And then there was the grand showmanship of using trebuchets for psychological warfare. Dead horses, rotting corpses, even barrels filled with manure were launched into cities. At times, it was less about smashing stone and more about smashing morale. The defenders didn't just see their walls crumbling. They smelled death, disease, and despair literally flying through the air. For Marjorie, inside the besieged town, every thud of a projectile was followed by dread. Would it be another stone shaking her home to its foundations, or something more grotesque landing in the marketplace to rot in the sun? Siege engines were as much about spectacle as they were about strategy, and medieval commanders, perhaps bored by the monotony of waiting, never missed the chance to make their wars theatrical. Siege towers deserve their own chapter in Absurdity. These towering behemoths, sometimes higher than the castle walls themselves, rolled forward on creaking wheels, packed with ladders and soldiers eager to storm the battlements. Covered in rawhides soaked in water to resist fire, they looked impressive, like mobile fortresses crawling toward the enemy. But castles were rarely kind enough to stand on level ground. More often than not, the towers bogged down in mud, tilted dangerously, or fell apart before reaching the walls. Defenders gleefully poured boiling pitch, or hurled fire onto them, watching with satisfaction as weeks of labour went up in smoke. And for the soldiers trapped inside, Thomas perhaps shoved into one. It was a death trap, the wooden walls turning into ovens while screams filled the air. Siege towers were the medieval equivalent of bringing a parade float to a knife fight, flashy, expensive, and often doomed. Battering rams, though less glamorous, were brutally effective when conditions allowed. A giant log, swung relentlessly against gates, could eventually break even the strongest wood. But the defenders were not helpless. They poured boiling water, oil, or molten lead onto the men below, or dropped massive stones directly onto the ram. Chronicles tell of defenders heating sand until it glowed and then pouring it through the gaps in armour, searing flesh in ways that arrows never could. One can almost hear the screams echoing beneath the gates, a reminder that medieval war rarely matched the noble songs sung about it. For Marjorie, hearing the thundering rhythm of a ram was a terror unlike hunger or disease. It was the sound of her city's heart being battered to splinters. Mining was perhaps the least glamorous but most feared of all strategies. Attackers dug tunnels beneath the walls, shoring them up with timber, then set the supports on fire. The walls collapsed into the void, creating breaches for assault. The defenders countered with their own tunnels, leading to underground battles fought in choking smoke and darkness. Imagine Thomas, shovel in hand, crawling through a tunnel barely wide enough to breathe, his ears straining for the sound of enemy pickaxes. Now imagine the sudden crash as two tunnels broke into each other, and men fought with daggers and axes underground, suffocating in the fumes of their own fires. This was warfare stripped of any semblance of glory, reduced to hacking blindly in the dark like trapped animals. Of course, not every machine succeeded. Chronicles are filled with tales of engines collapsing mid-use, towers sinking in mud, rams set ablaze before making a single dent. Sometimes, the spectacle achieved nothing but laughter from defenders watching safely from above. The irony is rich. While disease and hunger killed thousands efficiently and invisibly, these massive machines drained resources for outcomes that were often laughably anticlimactic. Yet kings and lords adored them. Why? Because they looked like progress. They reassured soldiers that something was happening, even if that something ended with carpenters crying into piles of charred wood. Criticism of siege engines was not absent in the medieval world. Some chroniclers openly mocked the waste of time and resources, noting how entire forests were felled to build machines that never reached the walls. Others pointed out the hypocrisy of rulers investing so heavily in wooden monstrosities while ignoring the starving soldiers in their own camps. Siege warfare, in this sense, was theatre for the elite, a stage where lords showcased their wealth and determination, while common soldiers like Thomas broke their backs dragging logs. Meanwhile, civilians like Marjorie lived in terror of every crash and splinter, proof that these machines caused suffering even when they failed. And that's the irony worth remembering. The machines of destruction were symbols of both human ingenuity and human folly. They showed what medieval engineers could achieve with rope, timber, and persistence, but they also showed how little those achievements mattered compared to the relentless forces of hunger and disease. At best, they sped up an inevitable end. At worst, they collapsed in mud, wasted resources, and left both sides exhausted. The true winners of siege warfare were never the machines. It was always famine, pestilence, and pride, grinding away long after the last trebuchet stone had flown. For Thomas, the memory of pulling ropes on a trebuchet, sweating for hours just to launch a single stone, would stay with him longer than any battle cry. For Marjorie, the memory of projectiles crashing into her town, shaking walls and nerves alike, became part of her nightmares. Neither of them would remember glory. They would remember noise, fear, and the absurdity of machines that destroyed far more lives than they ever saved. Siege engines were supposed to be instruments of victory. More often, they were monuments to human stubbornness, creaking loudly before collapsing into the mud. Chapter 6. Digging for Victory. If trebuchets were the loud, dramatic actors of siege warfare, then mining was the quiet assassin. No crashing stones, no roaring fires, just the patient scrape of shovels beneath the earth, the muffled crack of timber supports burning, and then the sudden, catastrophic collapse of stone walls above. Mining was the medieval equivalent of sneaking under the stage to cut the ropes, and for defenders, it was terrifying because you never knew when the ground beneath you would give way. Siege warfare had already turned the surface world into a cesspit of hunger and disease. Mining opened a whole new theatre of misery beneath the soil. The principle was deceptively simple. Attackers dug tunnels beneath castle walls, propping them up with wooden beams. Once the tunnel reached far enough, they stacked it with flammable materials, straw, pitch, tar, even pig fat, and then set it ablaze. The supports collapsed, the earth shifted, and down came a section of wall. It was ugly, effective, and required courage that can only be described as insane. Imagine Thomas, our reluctant conscript, sent underground with a shovel and a pick, crawling through a shaft barely wide enough to move, the air hot and stale, the walls creaking ominously. every breath filled with dust, every sound amplified by fear. And always the thought, what if the defenders heard him digging? Because the defenders were listening. They developed countermining, digging their own tunnels to intercept the attackers. The moment two tunnels met, underground battles erupted in the dark. Forget knights in shining armour. This was war fought by half-starved men swinging picks and daggers in choking smoke, blinded by torchlight. There was no room for shields, barely room to breathe, and death came not only by blade, but by suffocation when fires consumed the air. It was claustrophobia turned into strategy, and it was as miserable as it sounds. Historical accounts remind us just how destructive mining could be. During the siege of Rochester Castle in 1205, King John's men tunnelled under the walls and collapsed part of the fortress. Chronicles gleefully mention that pigs were used to fuel the fire-fat pigs, chosen specifically for their grease, which burned hotter and longer than wood alone. Imagine the smell, roasted pork wafting up from beneath the earth, while the walls above cracked and tumbled. It was practical, yes, but also grotesque, blending culinary imagery with destruction. Critics of King John had plenty to say about his cruelty, but even his enemies admitted the method worked. For defenders like Marjorie trapped inside, mining was a nightmare because it was invisible. With starvation, you saw the bread disappear. With disease, you saw the sick fall. With trebuchets, you saw the stones fly. But with mining, there was only an eerie silence until suddenly the ground shook and part of your world collapsed in rubble. Defenders sometimes dropped bowls of water near the walls, watching for ripples to detect underground activity. Imagine the dread of seeing the water quiver, proof that unseen hands were clawing toward you beneath the earth. The psychological toll was immense. Every creak of stone, every distant rumble, could mean the walls were about to betray you. Mining was labour-intensive, often dragging on for weeks, sometimes months. Attackers risked cave-ins, poisonous fumes, and sudden collapses. The work was hot, exhausting, and utterly thankless. Thomas probably wondered if he'd die suffocating underground long before he ever saw the inside of the castle. And the irony? Even successful mining wasn't always decisive. Sometimes walls collapsed, but defenders held the breach. Other times the tunnels failed entirely, wasting weeks of labour. Chroniclers, never shy about sarcasm, often recorded these failures with thinly veiled amusement. The miners dug, but the wall remained, one might write, which is medieval shorthand for all that work, and nothing to show but blisters. Still, mining terrified defenders because it undermined their sense of security, literally. Castles were built to stand, to resist, to project permanence. When a wall collapsed, not from an enemy's sword, but from the earth itself, it shattered morale. It reminded everyone that even stone was vulnerable, that even the strongest fortress could be undone by men with shovels and fire. And perhaps that was the cruelest trick of mining. It turned the very ground beneath you into an enemy. Criticism of this tactic lingers even in modern retellings. Yes, it was ingenious engineering, but it was also spectacularly destructive. Entire sections of fortifications reduced to rubble, towns collapsing into pits, civilians crushed in their homes. And for what? So that one lord could claim victory over another in disputes often as petty as inheritance squabbles. It's hard not to roll your eyes at the waste. Men burned pigs alive to collapse walls, while children starved a few feet away. Siege warfare at its most brilliant was still soaked in absurdity. And yet, mining persisted for centuries because it worked just often enough to justify the misery. Even as hunger and disease continued to decide most sieges, commanders loved the drama of watching walls tumble. It made them feel clever, powerful, and decisive. But as with trebuchets and towers, the true price was always paid by men like Thomas, sweating in suffocating darkness, and women like Marjorie, praying in houses that could collapse without warning. Mining was less a tool of victory than a reminder of how far humans will go to avoid admitting defeat. So here we are, above the ground, men rotting in camps, inside the walls, civilians starving, and beneath the earth, miners suffocating in the dark. A siege was total war in every direction, attacking not only walls, but bodies, spirits, and even the soil itself. Digging for victory sounds clever on parchment, but in practice it was yet another endurance test layered onto the misery. The ground itself became treacherous, faith in stone crumbled, and all the while disease and famine sat back, chuckling, knowing they would finish the job anyway. If siege towers were the medieval showpieces and trebuchets the thundering celebrities, then mining was the sinister background villain, quiet, patient, and devastating when it finally revealed itself. By this stage in a siege, everyone was already exhausted. Hunger gnawed, disease festered, spirits cracked. And then, as if life wasn't already unbearable, came the fear that the very ground beneath you might suddenly disappear. Mining was the one tactic that struck not only at walls but at the mind, because unlike the crashing stones of trebuchets or the flaming arrows lighting up the night sky, tunnels were invisible until the disaster happened. Picture Thomas again, hunched in the half-dark, hacking away at soil with a pick. His breath comes short, the air hot and heavy with smoke from pitch-soaked torches. Around him, a handful of fellow conscripts dig quietly, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. Every creak of timber above their heads a reminder that they could be crushed at any moment. Their orders are simple: dig until the wall groans, then stack the chamber with fuel, light it, and run before the earth collapses. It was dirty, brutal, and terrifying work. There was no glory to be had underground. No songs were ever written about miners suffocating in their own smoke. Meanwhile, Marjorie, huddled inside the fortress, heard only whispers. Citizens traded rumours of strange noises near the walls, of bowls of water placed on the ground rippling with unseen vibrations. Defenders lay their ears to the earth, straining for the faint scrape of enemy shovels. Some nights the city went quiet, everyone listening for the sound of betrayal beneath their feet, and when defenders did dig countermines, the results were straight out of a nightmare. Imagine two groups of desperate men breaking into each other's tunnels, fighting in choking darkness where the only light came from a sputtering torch. The air filled with dust, the walls threatened to collapse, and combatants hacked blindly with axes and daggers until one side fled or suffocated. Warfare doesn't get more claustrophobic than that. The historical record gives us chilling examples. At the siege of Rochester in 1215, King John's miners brought down part of the castle wall by burning pig fat under the supports. The chroniclers, with their usual flair for detail, even noted the screams of animals sacrificed for this grotesque fuel. The stench of burning flesh mixed with collapsing stone must have been unforgettable. At the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, Edward I of England employed miners alongside his famous siege engines, demonstrating that even the mightiest machines work best when paired with shovels. Elsewhere, defenders sometimes flooded tunnels, diverting rivers into shafts to drown attackers underground. Ingenious, yes, but also a reminder that this was war reduced to drowning men in mud, like trapped rats. Mining was also a drain on resources. Entire teams of men spent weeks underground, consuming food and fuel that could have been used elsewhere. Carpenters built endless wooden supports. Blacksmiths forged tools, and animals hauled soil away, all for the chance to bring down a few meters of wall. Sometimes it worked brilliantly. Other times, the wall barely shifted, and the miners' months of labour literally sank back into the ground. Chroniclers often recorded these failures with thin amusement. Nothing summed up the futility of siege warfare better than tunnels collapsing harmlessly while both armies continued to starve and rot above. The psychological damage, however, was undeniable. Defenders who once trusted their walls began to doubt them. Every rumble, every crack, every distant groan of stone could trigger panic. Some cities even executed supposed traitors simply for spreading rumors that the walls were about to collapse. Fear did as much damage as the tunnels themselves. For Marjorie, it meant sleepless nights, clutching her children as tremors rattled through the fortress, praying that her home wasn't perched above the next hollow chamber. The walls had once been symbols of strength. Undermining, they became reminders of vulnerability. From a modern perspective, it's hard not to criticize the sheer madness of it. Mining was ingenious, yes, but also monstrously wasteful and cruel. Imagine sacrificing men, animals, and resources just to make a wall collapse, while disease and famine were already doing the job faster and cheaper. Yet commanders persisted, dazzled by the drama of seeing stone crumble. Perhaps that was the point. Sieges were as much theatre as they were strategy, and watching a wall collapse was more satisfying than waiting for another dozen peasants to die of hunger. Still, the price was high, and the suffering immense. For Thomas, mining became another endurance test layered onto his already miserable existence. His body weakened by hunger, his lungs filled with dust. He swung his pick and wondered whether he'd be buried alive before ever seeing the inside of the fortress. For Marjorie, mining was invisible terror, the ground itself betraying her trust. Between them stood the absurd pride of lords who refused to negotiate, preferring instead to burn pigs under walls while their own people wasted away. It was a parody of strategy, an endurance test dressed as ingenuity. And so mining, like every other tool of siege warfare, proved the same lesson. Walls might fall, armies might break, but it was always ordinary people who paid the price. Whether crushed underground, starved in streets, or suffocated in smoke, they bore the brunt of a war that claimed to be about honour, but was really about stubbornness. Mining may have been clever engineering, but in the grand tally of siege warfare, it was just another way to prove how far humans will go to destroy one another when patience fails and pride refuses to bend. Chapter 7. Psychological Warfare. If famine starved the body and disease rotted the flesh, then psychological warfare chewed at the mind until even the strongest spirits cracked. Sieges weren't only about who had thicker walls or bigger machines, they were about who could endure the terror of constant reminders that death wasn't just coming. It was already waiting at the gate. Medieval commanders understood this well. They didn't just want to break stone, they wanted to break willpower. And so the siege became a theatre of cruelty, where fear was wielded as carefully as swords, and despair was flung across walls just as often as boulders. Let's begin with the grotesque tradition of turning corpses into weapons. It was not enough to let the dead rot in trenches outside the city. No, the besiegers wanted the defenders to share in the misery. Catapults and trebuchets were loaded with the bloated remains of men, women, horses, anything suitably revolting, and hurled over the walls. Sometimes it was strategy, spreading disease. Sometimes it was theatre, a grotesque reminder that the attackers could not only kill you, but also desecrate you. Imagine Marjorie in her fortress, clutching her children as a body explodes in the square, maggots spilling out, the stench of rot filling the air. Imagine Thomas on the other side, straining at ropes to launch another corpse, trying not to gag while his commander insists this will break their spirit. It was a medieval version of psychological bombing, and it worked, because nothing kills morale faster than your neighbour's head landing in your courtyard. Then there was noise. The endless noise. Sieges were marked by monotony, yes, but monotony punctuated by deliberate bursts of terror. Drums beat through the night, horns blared at random hours. Attackers shouted insults, daring defenders to surrender, sometimes using prisoners as mouthpieces. Picture a captured soldier, dragged to the walls, forced to beg his comrades to lay down their arms before being executed on the spot. It was brutality staged for maximum effect, because if fear didn't make defenders surrender, shame might. And of course, the defenders had their own tricks. Mocking songs hurled back across the walls, dangling captives in plain sight, or taunting the attackers with displays of food, even if the bread was their last loaf. Medieval warfare wasn't just bloody, it was petty. One of the most infamous examples of psychological cruelty came during the Siege of Limoges in 1370, when defenders displayed their captives on the walls, mutilated and broken, to show they weren't afraid. The besiegers responded in kind, executing prisoners within sight of the city. It became a vicious exchange of spectacles, each side trying to outdo the other in cruelty. None of it advanced the siege, but it poisoned morale on both sides. This was the ugly paradox of psychological warfare. It didn't necessarily bring victory, but it ensured everyone suffered more than they already were. And let's not forget the use of fire as theatre. Flaming projectiles were as much about fear as destruction. A single fire could spread through a medieval town of timber houses, and everyone knew it. Each flaming barrel hurled by trebuchet was a message: we can burn your world down whenever we like. The defenders' frantic efforts to douse flames were not only exhausting but demoralizing. Marjorie would have seen her neighbours running with buckets, their faces ghostly in the glow, while children cried in terror at the thought that their home would vanish in ash. Thomas, meanwhile, would have watched from the camp, the fire lighting up the night, thinking perhaps this was the first real progress they had made after months of waiting. Fire, unlike famine, was immediate, and its psychological impact lingered even after the flames were doused. Theatrics extended to executions too. Attackers who captured messengers or civilians trying to flee often killed them in full view of the fortress, a grisly warning to those inside. Heads were displayed on spikes. Bodies hung from trees, sometimes even mutilated before being paraded around the walls. Defenders retaliated in kind, executing captured soldiers and throwing their remains back at the besiegers. This exchange of cruelty was designed less to achieve tactical gains than to grind down the enemy's will to resist. It was medieval trash talk, only with corpses instead of insults. Psychological warfare wasn't confined to the battlefield either. It seeped into rumour and superstition. Inside a besieged town, whispers spread like wildfire that the attackers had reinforcements coming, that the wells had been poisoned, that traitors lurked within the walls. Fear turned neighbour against neighbour, suspicion grew, and order broke down. Executions for supposed treason became common, sometimes targeting innocent people simply because someone needed to be blamed. Hunger may have weakened bodies, but paranoia hollowed out communities. Siege warfare was as much about destroying trust as it was about destroying walls. And here's the part that deserves sharp criticism. None of this was necessary. Most sieges would have ended eventually from hunger or disease, but commanders couldn't resist adding cruelty to the mix. It wasn't enough for people to starve quietly. They had to be terrorized while starving. It wasn't enough for defenders to die of plague. They had to live in constant dread of what might land in their courtyard next. Theatrics of cruelty became an end in itself, a way for lords to prove their ruthlessness, as if starving peasants were keeping score. Chroniclers occasionally condemned this with barely veiled sarcasm, noting how valiant commanders proved their strength by tormenting civilians who had no choice in the matter. For Thomas, psychological warfare meant another layer of misery to endure. It was not enough to be hungry, sick, and bored. Now he had to stomach the sight of corpses flying overhead and the screams of prisoners executed for effect. For Marjorie, it meant living in fear of every crash outside her door, every whisper of treachery, every new horror devised by men who treated war like theatre. Between them stretched the absurd logic of the siege, that the mind must be broken even as the body wasted away. So when we call medieval sieges endurance tests, it wasn't just about hunger or disease or machines. It was about living under constant psychological pressure, the endless gnawing dread that safety was an illusion and cruelty the only constant. Stones might crumble, bodies might starve, but it was fear carefully cultivated, deliberately inflicted, that often decided who surrendered first. And like everything else in siege warfare, it came at the cost of ordinary people trapped in the middle, pawns in a performance they never asked to see. If you think medieval warfare was all about boulders, swords, and battering rams, then you've underestimated the imagination of commanders who had far too much time and far too little mercy. Psychological warfare was the art of making your enemy break down in their own mind long before their walls collapsed. And the tactics ranged from grotesque to petty, from terrifyingly effective to laughably absurd. What united them was the goal: to remind the defenders that survival was pointless, that surrender was inevitable, and that the enemy was willing to sink to any depth, literally and figuratively, to prove it. One of the most chilling weapons was spectacle itself. The execution of prisoners became a macabre form of entertainment, staged within sight of the fortress walls. Captives were dragged forward, humiliated, and often mutilated before being put to death. Sometimes their bodies were displayed on spikes or hung from trees where everyone inside could see them. At the siege of Béziers during the Albigensian Crusade, thousands were slaughtered, and survivors were paraded as examples. The message was clear: resist, and this is your fate. Now imagine Marjorie watching from her town, clutching her children as the bodies of men she once knew swayed in the breeze outside the gates. That kind of horror leaves marks on the mind long after the battle is over. The besiegers also loved a good taunt. Medieval chroniclers record stories of armies staging mock feasts within sight of starving cities, deliberately roasting animals on open fires so the smell of meat drifted over the walls. Bread and wine were paraded on wagons, waved at defenders who hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks. Some accounts even describe attackers tossing loaves of bread over the walls, not as gifts, but as insults, reminders that they had food while the people inside were gnawing on bark. For Thomas, on the outside, it might have been the only time he saw a fresh loaf in months, and the cruelty wasn't lost on him either. Soldiers grumbled that lords wasted food for theatre while their own men still starved. Psychological warfare didn't just torment the defenders, it often irritated the attackers who had to endure their commander's vanity. Noise was another weapon of choice. Armies would pound drums through the night, blow horns at random hours, and shout threats or insults just when defenders thought they might finally get some rest. Imagine trying to sleep while an endless chorus of jeers and pounding echoed against your stone walls. Sleep deprivation was as effective then as it is now, and it didn't require much effort. The defenders became anxious, jumpy, and prone to mistakes. And if you think the attackers were noble knights leading this cacophony, think again. It was usually conscripts like Thomas, forced to beat drums until their hands bled, while lords slept comfortably in their tents, congratulating themselves on their clever psychological strategy. Perhaps the most grotesque example of psychological warfare was the use of corpses as projectiles. We've already touched on this, but it deserves emphasis. Dead bodies weren't just a health hazard, they were a symbol. They told defenders, "Your fate is to rot just like these." At the siege of Kaffa in 1346, Mongols famously launched plague-ridden corpses into the city, possibly sparking the Black Death across Europe. Whether that's true or not, the imagery alone is chilling. Disease became a missile. Death itself turned into a weapon of despair. Marjorie would have seen these horrors fall from the sky, her world reduced to a grotesque lottery where the next corpse might crash into her very home. And then there was the theatre of mercy, or rather, the cruel parody of it. Attackers sometimes offered terms of surrender, promising safety if the city yielded. But everyone knew these promises were fragile at best, lies at worst. When defenders refused, attackers often retaliated by escalating cruelty, mutilating prisoners, burning villages in sight of the walls, or torturing captives to make sure their screams carried. It was a calculated campaign of despair. The defenders faced a choice: surrender and trust men who had just thrown a diseased cow over your walls, or keep fighting and starve. Some choice. The defenders, of course, gave as good as they got when they could. They taunted besiegers with jeers, displayed enemy heads on spikes, and occasionally staged feasts on the battlements to mock attackers' hunger. During the siege of Harlech Castle, defenders supposedly roasted meat in plain sight, taunting the besiegers by showing they still had food. It was petty, but in a war of endurance, petty mattered. The problem was that both sides escalated cruelty without actually advancing the siege. Everyone suffered more, but walls still stood, bellies still growled, and disease still spread. Psychological warfare often turned into a grotesque stalemate of insults and horrors, with civilians paying the steepest price. And here lies the thread of criticism that cannot be ignored. Psychological warfare was less about strategy and more about pride. Commanders were desperate to prove their ruthlessness, to show the world they could out-terrify their opponents. But it rarely decided the outcome. Hunger and disease still did most of the work. All the cruelty, all the theatrics, often only deepened suffering without changing results. Chroniclers noticed this, writing with sarcasm about lords who wasted time staging spectacles while their men starved. You can almost hear the eye rolls in the parchment. Another noble showed his strength today by hanging captives. The city did not surrender. In other words, cruelty looked impressive, but accomplished little. For Thomas, psychological warfare was another layer of absurdity. He endured the smell of burning corpses hurled back by defenders, the endless drumming that robbed him of sleep, and the staged feasts that reminded him his own stomach was empty. For Marjorie, it was sheer terror. Every noise in the night, every body crashing into her city, every scream carried on the wind chipped away at her will. Between them stretched a cruel theatre where civilians were the unwilling audience, forced to watch a play of horrors until someone finally gave in. So when we describe sieges as endurance tests, we must remember that victory wasn't only about walls or armies. It was about who could endure the longest barrage of fear, shame, and despair. Psychological warfare turned suffering into performance, cruelty into spectacle, and fear into strategy. And like so much of medieval war, it was less about necessity and more about pride. An endless, gruesome show staged for no one's benefit except the egos of those in command. Chapter 8. Civilians in the Crossfire. If siege warfare was an endurance test for soldiers, it was a death sentence for civilians. For every knight boasting of glory and every commander patting himself on the back for his strategic patience, there were thousands of ordinary men, women, and children who paid the real price. Castles and fortified towns may have been built to keep people safe, but in practice they turned into giant pressure cookers, trapping civilians in hunger, fear, and despair until something finally cracked. It wasn't soldiers who bore the brunt of sieges. It was bakers, weavers, children, and old men who had never lifted a sword in their lives. From the moment the gates closed, life changed. Food, already scarce in normal times, became a commodity of survival. Merchants closed their stalls, prices soared, and only the wealthy could afford what little remained. Marjorie, our weaver's wife, saw it firsthand. Once she could sell her cloth and buy bread at the market. Now the market was silent, her loom abandoned, her days consumed with scrounging for scraps. Mothers boiled weeds into soup, fathers cut strips of leather to chew, and children begged for food their parents could not provide. The privileged feasted in stone halls while the poor gnawed on bones picked clean weeks before. Nothing exposes the cruelty of hierarchy faster than famine in a besieged city. And when the food truly ran out, desperation set in. Chronicles tell us of towns where rats and dogs vanished first, followed by horses, cats, and eventually even human corpses. Cannibalism, whispered as unthinkable, sometimes became reality. At the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, stories spread of people reduced to such extremes. Chroniclers wrote about it with horror, but also a touch of judgment, as though starving people had any choice. This is where the criticism bites hardest. Nobles who caused the suffering often emerged unscathed, while peasants endured horrors that chroniclers later condemned from the safety of their writing desks. It was easy to judge cannibalism when you were not the one watching your children waste away. Outside the walls, life wasn't much kinder. Villages near the siege site were stripped bare, peasants robbed of their harvest, livestock slaughtered by passing armies. Civilians caught in the open were sometimes used as human shields, driven toward the walls to absorb arrows. Some were forced to haul siege equipment, expendable labourers pressed into service until disease or exhaustion killed them. For people like Thomas, already miserable as a conscript, at least there was the illusion of soldiers' honour. For peasants dragged unwillingly into the camps, there was only humiliation and despair. They weren't soldiers, yet they bled for the siege all the same. Worse still, civilians often became pawns in negotiations. Some commanders expelled non-combatants from the city to conserve food for soldiers. It sounds practical, until you realise that the besiegers rarely allowed them through. Refugees trapped between armies starved in no man's land, dying by the hundreds under the walls of the city they once called home. Mothers with infants, old men leaning on sticks, children barely able to walk, left outside to rot in sight of both camps. One chronicler at the siege of Jerusalem described thousands left to die between Christian crusaders and Muslim defenders, a grim monument to the cruelty of strategy. Marjorie might have been spared that fate inside the gates, but she knew her neighbours could be cast out at any moment, sacrificed in the cold logic of rationing. And even survival didn't guarantee safety. When cities finally fell, civilians often faced massacres or enslavement. After months of endurance, the gates would break, and soldiers, hungry, angry, and eager for loot, poured in. Streets ran red, not only with the blood of defenders, but with that of ordinary people. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099 saw tens of thousands slaughtered indiscriminately. Chroniclers, even those sympathetic to the Crusaders, admitted the blood ran up to the ankles in holy places. In other sieges, survivors were enslaved, marched off in chains as spoils of war. For the average person, survival often meant trading one prison for another. The psychological toll on civilians was immense. Hunger was bad enough, but the constant fear was worse. Each day brought new rumours, reinforcements coming, walls about to collapse, wells poisoned by traitors. Suspicion festered. Neighbours accused each other of hoarding food. Priests warned of divine punishment, and anyone suspected of sympathy with the enemy risked a public execution. Civilians weren't just trapped by walls, they were trapped by paranoia. For Marjorie, every knock at the door could mean a neighbour asking for food she didn't have, or worse, accusing her of treachery. Siege warfare hollowed out communities, replacing trust with fear, and leaving scars that lasted long after the armies moved on. And here is where the deepest criticism belongs. Civilians had no choice. They didn't declare the war, didn't build the walls, didn't decide when to resist or surrender. Yet they bore the heaviest burdens, starved first, died first, and were remembered last. Chronicles focus on kings, lords, and generals. But the real story of siege warfare was written in the suffering of ordinary people. Marjorie and her children mattered less to history than the ambitions of nobles who treated entire populations as bargaining chips. If siege warfare was the ultimate endurance test, then civilians were the ones most cruelly forced to take it without ever signing up. Even when sieges ended in negotiation instead of slaughter, the cost was staggering. Fields lay wasted, villages burned, towns emptied of life. Survivors carried memories of starvation, fear, and betrayal. Children who lived through a siege often grew up marked by trauma, their lives shaped by a war they never chose. And yet, lords rebuilt their castles, commanders wrote letters boasting of victory, and history marched on as though the suffering of thousands was just background noise to the squabbles of the powerful. For Thomas, the soldier outside the walls, civilians were both pitied and envied. He pitied them for their hunger, but he envied them when he imagined the walls gave them some protection from the filth of the camps. For Marjorie, civilians weren't pawns on a chessboard. They were her neighbours, her family, herself. She endured starvation, fear, and the collapse of community, all for the pride of men she'd never met. That is the true tragedy of siege warfare. Not the fall of stone, but the breaking of lives too ordinary to be remembered by history, yet essential to understanding what these endurance tests really meant. If enduring a siege was a nightmare, then surviving one often felt like a cruel joke. Civilians who managed to cling to life through famine, disease, and fear rarely found relief once the gates finally fell. For them, the end of the siege wasn't victory or liberation. It was another chapter of misery. What happened to ordinary people after a siege depended less on their own endurance and more on the mood of the victors. And let's be honest, medieval armies weren't exactly famous for their restraint. When soldiers finally stormed a city, it was as though months of hunger, boredom, and frustration exploded in one violent rush. Commanders might have promised discipline, but discipline rarely stood a chance against thousands of angry, starving men suddenly unleashed. Streets turned into slaughterhouses. Civilians, men, women, and children alike were cut down indiscriminately. Chroniclers describe blood running ankle-deep after the sack of Jerusalem in 1099, a grisly image repeated at countless other sieges. To the victors, this was vengeance for months of resistance. To the civilians, it was the final betrayal of walls that had promised protection but delivered only a longer death. Even when massacres weren't total, the fate of civilians was rarely kind. Looting was inevitable. Soldiers ransacked homes, tore down doors, dragged furniture into the streets, and stripped families of the little they had left. Marjorie, if she survived long enough to see her city fall, might have watched soldiers trample her loom to pieces, steal the last thread of her cloth, and walk away laughing. Wealthier citizens were sometimes spared outright murder, but only because they could be ransomed. Being rich enough to buy your life was the closest thing to mercy medieval warfare had to offer. For those who weren't killed, slavery often followed. Captured civilians were bound in chains, marched away as spoils of war, and sold in markets far from their homes. Women and children were especially vulnerable, their lives reduced to bargaining chips in the economic machinery of conquest. Chroniclers, ever eager to describe the scale of plunder, often listed captives as part of the loot alongside cattle, gold, and grain. Human lives were catalogued as casually as livestock, their individuality erased by the arithmetic of victory. This, more than any stone wall or siege engine, exposes the brutal indifference of the age. And if by some miracle civilians escaped massacre or enslavement, they still faced the ruins of their homes. Cities after sieges were gutted shells, streets littered with rubble and corpses, wells poisoned, fields burned. Survivors scavenged like animals, picking through ruins for scraps of food, salvaging wood from broken homes, burying the dead as best they could. Disease, already rampant during the siege, often exploded in the aftermath, feeding on the unburied bodies and stagnant water. In many cases, more civilians died after the walls fell than during the siege itself. The supposed end of their endurance test was simply a new phase of suffering. Sometimes victors tried to impose order, especially if they wanted to hold the city. They repaired walls, restored markets, and declared peace. But rebuilding took years, sometimes decades, and scars remained. The population rarely recovered to pre-siege numbers. Families were scattered, trade routes disrupted, and trauma etched into memory. Marjorie, if she somehow survived and returned to her ruined home, would have faced a lifetime of rebuilding from nothing, haunted by the loss of neighbours and the silence of children who hadn't made it. Her endurance didn't earn her safety, it earned her a lifetime reminder that survival was often the cruelest burden. Critics of siege warfare at the time did occasionally point out the hypocrisy. Victors claimed divine approval for their conquests, boasting that God had delivered them victory, even as the blood of civilians soaked the earth. Chroniclers recorded noble speeches about justice, while describing cities left in ashes. You can almost hear the sarcasm between the lines. Kings preached righteousness, while their soldiers stuffed pockets with stolen silver and dragged women into slavery. If this was divine justice, then heaven must have been running a very questionable legal system. Not all sieges ended in massacre, of course. Sometimes cities negotiated surrender before the final breach. In those cases, civilians were often spared mass slaughter, but spared is relative. It usually meant handing over wealth, livestock, and hostages, sometimes even accepting occupation by foreign soldiers. And let's not pretend this was kindness. It was simply efficiency. A city gutted by famine and disease wasn't much use if everyone inside was dead. Marjorie might have been forced to watch as her children were taken as hostages for good behaviour, or her husband drafted into forced labour for the victors. Survival under occupation was survival in name only. For Thomas, the soldier outside, the aftermath of a siege was no triumph either. He might finally taste fresh food, finally loot a little silver, finally walk through the gates he had stared at for months. But the stench of death lingered, the screams of civilians echoed, and whatever loot he carried was soon gone, gambled away, or spent on ale. His endurance brought him nothing more than a few fleeting moments of satisfaction. And then the army marched on to the next siege, the next camp, the next pit of filth. So here lies the bitter truth. Civilians endured the worst, survived the longest, and remembered the most. They weren't just caught in the crossfire, they were the crossfire. Their lives were gambled away by commanders on both sides, and their suffering was treated as a natural byproduct of war. Chroniclers wrote of walls and kings, but behind every wall was Marjorie, behind every army was a village stripped bare, and behind every victory was a civilian graveyard. If siege warfare was the ultimate endurance test, then civilians passed it more often than anyone else, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. They endured famine, disease, fear, massacre, and slavery, and still rebuilt their lives in the ashes. And history, in its arrogance, remembered the names of kings while forgetting theirs. That, perhaps, is the greatest cruelty of all: survival without recognition, endurance without glory. For the civilians of medieval sieges, the real victory was simply waking up the next day, even when the world around them had burned to the ground. Chapter 9. The Final Assault. There is a moment in every siege when patience cracks, when stones and hunger and months of waiting boil into action. That moment is the final assault, and it was the scene that medieval chroniclers loved to describe in grotesque detail. Picture it: walls trembling from the pounding of trebuchets, defenders too weak from famine to lift their swords properly, and attackers drunk on the promise of loot charging headlong toward breaches torn in stone. For soldiers, this was the climax, the proof that months of mud and boredom had a payoff. For civilians, it was the nightmare they had feared since the first drumbeat of war. And for history, it was the sort of scene that conveniently glossed over human suffering in favour of grand tales of bravery. The final assault was chaos in every sense. Siege engines hammered at weak points, sappers dug tunnels beneath towers, and ladders went up in frantic rows. Defenders, gaunt and desperate, hurled rocks, poured boiling pitch, or dropped beams on the heads of men climbing the ladders. But no amount of improvisation could fully stop the momentum once attackers smelled blood. Months of starvation inside the walls made resistance shaky at best. By the time breaches appeared, defenders were often too weak to fight in formation. They stumbled forward like shadows of soldiers, more skeleton than man, trying to wield rusting swords with arms that trembled from hunger. One almost has to laugh at the absurdity, if only it weren't so tragic. For soldiers like Thomas, who had spent half a year slogging through mud outside the walls, the order to charge was both relief and terror. He knew that climbing a ladder into a storm of arrows and rocks wasn't exactly safe. But discipline broke down in the frenzy. hesitation was replaced by the mob's push from behind. He scrambled upward, heart pounding, more afraid of being trampled by his own comrades than of the defenders above. In that madness, individuality disappeared. Armies became a mass of bodies, sweat, steel, and blood, forcing its way upward. And if you slipped and fell, well, good luck, because you'd be crushed underfoot by the next wave, and nobody was stopping to help. Defenders had their own nightmares. Imagine standing atop a wall you had once believed invincible, only to see it crumble beneath bombardment. The stones you had trusted for generations betrayed you, opening cracks wide enough for whole armies to pour in. And worse than the stones was the sound, the roar of attackers, the creak of ladders, the thunder of battering rams, and the screams of men dying all at once. A city's population might have spent months praying for salvation, only to watch salvation fail in an afternoon. Hope evaporated in real time as ladders sprouted like weeds against the wall and breaches widened into doorways for destruction. Civilians like Marjorie, already hollow-eyed from famine, had little to do but hide. Some crowded into churches, clutching icons, hoping that sacred ground might spare them. Others huddled in cellars, praying that the soldiers would pass them by. It rarely worked. Churches often became prime targets, not sanctuaries, because soldiers knew valuables were hidden there. Even hiding underground wasn't safe when fire spread through the streets. Whole families suffocated in smoke before swords ever reached them. It's tempting to romanticize the final defense of a city, but for most people it was nothing more than a prolonged panic attack in the middle of an inferno. The brutality of the final breach was deliberate. Attackers wanted to terrify not just this city, but the next. If word spread that resistance ended in slaughter, then other cities might surrender without a fight. Terror was the cheapest weapon of all, and medieval commanders wielded it with cynical efficiency. At Béziers in 1209, papal forces supposedly killed the entire population, men, women, and children, under the infamous phrase, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Whether the quote was literal or embellished, the massacre itself was real enough, and its message spread like wildfire. Criticism of this so-called divine strategy was muted at best, because who in their right mind dared critique a victory drenched in sanctity? Yet even as the walls fell and soldiers poured in, victory was never clean. Attackers died in droves in those final minutes, crushed by falling stones, boiled alive by pitch, or skewered by arrows shot at point-blank range. Thomas might have made it to the top of the wall, only to find himself face to face with defenders fighting for their lives, men who had nothing left to lose. In that moment, battle wasn't about tactics or strategy. It was about teeth bared in desperation, knives pulled when swords snapped, hands grappling in the dirt. Death was so intimate that it felt less like war and more like collective murder. And history's poets later wrapped it up with phrases like valor and glory, because heaven forbid anyone admit that it was just butchery in the dust. Sometimes cities staged desperate last stands at their gates or citadels, rallying around symbols of resistance. These moments made for good stories. Flags held aloft, speeches shouted from walls, martyrs remembered for centuries. But the truth is that most of these last stands ended the same way, with the flag trampled, the speech drowned out by screams, and the martyrs forgotten once the looting began. Even in so-called heroic defeats, survivors weren't inspired. They were enslaved, starved, or slaughtered. Glory was for the chroniclers, reality was for the dead. And let's not forget the irony of all this effort. Months of planning, months of digging, starving, waiting, and the final breach often lasted only hours. Cities that had endured half a year of siege collapsed in an afternoon. The endurance test, in other words, was mostly endurance of waiting. When the end came, it came swiftly, like a rotten dam bursting. For all the elaborate engines and strategies, war boiled down to a single chaotic rush, where luck mattered more than any brilliant commander. And yet, centuries later, Textbooks still praise the genius of this or that general, conveniently ignoring that most victories were sealed by exhaustion, not brilliance. For the civilians, the final assault was the end of the world they knew. Walls that had been their prison and their shield became the doors to death. Streets filled with fire, soldiers, and screams became places of execution. Marjorie's choice wasn't whether she would live, but whether she would die quickly or slowly. For Thomas, the soldier, the choice was whether to loot, kill, or both before the officers called order. Both were trapped in the machinery of a system that promised survival to neither, but still ground them forward. So the final assault, that supposedly glorious crescendo of siege warfare, was really just the ugliest encore of human cruelty. It showed, more than anything else, how fragile civilization was when hunger and ambition cracked the stones, and it reminded anyone paying attention that in the game of medieval war, walls weren't built to protect lives. They were built to delay inevitable death. The only real endurance test was how long you could stomach the waiting before the killing began. If segment 1 was about the moment the walls cracked, segment 2 is about what came after. The inside view. Imagine being within the city when the gates gave way, or when a breach yawned open like a wound in the side of the fortress. The shift was immediate. For weeks or months, life inside had been a grim routine of hunger, fear, and waiting. Suddenly, it turned into a frenzy of survival measured in seconds. Smoke curled through streets, fire leapt from thatched roofs, and the orderly grid of medieval life collapsed into chaos. People didn't think about defending their homes anymore. They thought about running, hiding, or praying that the next sword passed them by. The psychology of the final assault is fascinating and horrifying because every role shifted at once. Defenders who had worn the armour of knights or militia suddenly became cornered animals. Their oaths to king or city evaporated under the realization that resistance meant execution. Some threw down their arms, begging for mercy. Others doubled down, fighting like rabid dogs in alleys, determined to take as many invaders as possible before falling. And then there were those who simply froze. Chroniclers, of course, loved to tell of knights dying nobly with banners raised, but the truth is that most defenders died in confusion, trampled or cut down in the crush of bodies fleeing the breach. It wasn't a stage play of chivalry, it was a stampede. Inside the houses, families like Marjorie's clutched each other in silence. They'd heard rumours, stories from travellers, warnings from priests, but nothing could quite prepare them for the moment when the sounds of fighting thundered down the street. Think of it, the shuffle of boots, the clash of steel, the screams that grew louder with each passing heartbeat. Many people tried to flee to the central keep, the so-called last refuge of the city. But those keeps, built for defence, became traps. Once the gates shut behind them, the refugees were stuck, packed together in darkness, suffocating as attackers hammered at the walls. Some surrendered en masse when the keep was finally broken. Others were slaughtered wholesale because the victors had no interest in mercy. In either case, those last safe places offered about as much security as a locked coffin. And then there was fire. Fire was the universal language of final assaults. Attackers set it deliberately to flush people out of hiding, or it spread accidentally when flaming projectiles lit thatched roofs. Either way, the result was the same. Streets became infernos. Medieval cities, crammed with wood, cloth and pitch, burned like bonfires. Smoke choked civilians before swords touched them. Whole neighbourhoods collapsed into ash, sometimes with families still inside their cellars. Archaeologists occasionally find skeletons huddled together in burned-out basements, mute proof that survival plans often amounted to waiting for air that never came. Yet chroniclers tended to skip over those details, preferring to sing about the great victory of the faithful. It's strange how faith always looked victorious from outside the fire. For the attackers, the final rush into the city was the reward for months of waiting. Soldiers like Thomas surged through the gates, adrenaline replacing fatigue, greed replacing fear. Looting wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. In many medieval armies, plunder was the unofficial payment for service. When commanders promised the city is yours, what they meant was, take whatever you can carry and kill anyone who resists. The discipline of armies dissolved once they crossed the threshold. Neighbours who had starved together for months became commodities to be sold as slaves. Gold, silver, food, livestock, and human beings all ended up on the same tally sheet. One can almost hear the sarcasm dripping from the pages of history. Chroniclers praised their lords for delivering justice while turning a blind eye to the rape, slaughter, and looting that followed. The same pen that wrote of God's will carefully forgot to mention the children dashed against walls, the merchants gutted in their shops, or the women dragged into alleys. Those details, when they appear at all, surface centuries later in archaeological digs or in the bitter laments of survivors. But why bother writing about truth when victory sounded so much cleaner? After all, history is written by the winners, and winners rarely have the decency to admit they acted like butchers. The irony of medieval siege warfare is that the defenders who resisted bravely often suffered more than those who surrendered early. Entire cities were massacred because they had dared to hold out. On the other hand, cities that opened their gates without a fight were sometimes spared wholesale destruction. Though spared usually meant heavy fines, forced labour, or the execution of a few unlucky leaders as examples. In other words, you could die quickly for resisting or die slowly for obeying. Critics might call that a no-win scenario, but to medieval rulers it was simply policy. Mercy, after all, was expensive. Fear was cheap. Thomas, wading through streets of panic, probably thought less about policy and more about opportunity. Which house might have coins hidden under the floor? Which cellar might be stuffed with food? Which church might be hiding reliquaries of gold? He didn't see Marjorie clutching her children in terror. He saw potential spoils. And that was the cruel arithmetic of siege warfare. One person's famine was another person's payday. It wasn't personal, it was just the system. If there is a criticism to be made here, it is that the system was designed to normalize atrocity. Soldiers were conditioned to believe that murder and theft were not sins but privileges, rewards for surviving the wait. The fact that priests often blessed the plunder only rubbed salt into the wound. Imagine listening to a sermon about divine justice while smoke rose from your burning home. And yet, the human instinct to endure persisted even in this nightmare. Marjorie might have found a corner to hide, a sympathetic soldier to bribe, or a priest willing to shield her family for a price. Some civilians did survive final assaults, often through luck or negotiation. But survival was no guarantee of peace. Many survivors were enslaved, marched away in chains to be sold in distant markets. Others were pressed into rebuilding the very walls that had failed them, forced labour for their new masters. The siege never truly ended for them. It just changed form, from waiting for death to enduring servitude. Critics today might scoff at medieval commanders for their cruelty, but the truth is that their strategies worked. Terror pacified regions. Massacres discouraged rebellion. Fire erased resistance as effectively as diplomacy ever could. To expect chivalry in this context is almost laughable. Medieval war was not a chess game of noble knights. It was a sledgehammer applied until walls, bodies, and morale broke apart. The endurance test was not just for soldiers, it was for the very idea of humanity. And too often, humanity failed. The final assault was therefore not a climax in the heroic sense, but an unravelling. Civilization collapsed into its rawest form, survival of the cruelest. Those who endured had scars that no chronicle recorded. The rest were reduced to ash, bone, or the silence of forgotten names. And yet, centuries later, we talk about these sieges as if they were tales of strategy, as if diagrams of walls and engines matter more than the people crushed beneath them. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of siege warfare is the ability of history itself to look away from suffering. And with that, the picture of the final assault is complete. Smoke, fire, screaming, looting, and collapse. It was the grand finale that nobody wanted to attend, the moment where the endurance test ended, not with victory or honour, but with the cold truth that walls crumble, flesh burns, and morality bends to hunger and ambition. Chapter 10, Aftermath and Memory. The walls had fallen, the smoke had cleared, and the screams had dulled to silence. But if you think that meant peace had returned, you'd be mistaken. The aftermath of a medieval siege was often more drawn out, and more psychologically devastating than the assault itself. The battle ended in hours, maybe days, but the scars lasted for generations. When the dust settled, the victorious banners flapped over piles of rubble and corpses, and life, if you could call it that, had to begin again. That is the part of siege warfare people forget. Survival was only the beginning of a new ordeal. Let us picture the scene. The conquerors paraded through the ruined streets, drums beating, flags waving, commanders congratulating themselves for having restored order. Order, of course, was another word for submission. Buildings stood gutted and blackened, granaries were empty, and wells poisoned or fouled. Survivors stumbled out of hiding places, blinking in daylight like rats flushed from cellars. Some were rounded up immediately, tied with ropes, and marched into captivity. Others tried to salvage their homes, only to find charred beams and shattered doors. Families searched for one another in the wreckage, often finding nothing but burned bodies or silence. It is fashionable for chroniclers to write that the city was pacified. Pacified is a polite euphemism, a word that sounds like peace but really means erasure. Take Marjorie, our weary civilian, for example. She survived, clinging to her children in a corner while soldiers looted her street. The siege might have been over, but her suffering wasn't. In many cities, widows and orphans were forced into begging almost immediately. With fathers killed and property seized, whole households collapsed into poverty. Hunger did not vanish with the arrival of peace. It deepened, because the invaders confiscated what little was left. And yet, rulers still like to proclaim that normal life resumed after a siege. One has to admire the gall of such statements, considering that normal life now meant living amid ruins, without bread, under new masters who cared more about taxes than humanity. The conquerors, meanwhile, celebrated. Soldiers like Thomas strutted through streets with bags of loot, sometimes richer than they had ever been in their lives. But wealth gained that way had its curses. Gold looted from holy shrines was often melted and scattered, its sacred origins forgotten. Artifacts that once held meaning for a community were pawned in distant markets, stripped of memory and reverence. Soldiers blew their spoils on drink, gambling, or prostitutes, often squandering months of suffering in a single week of debauchery. It would be easy to criticize them as greedy, short-sighted brutes. And they were. But one should also remember the system they served. Medieval lords rarely paid their men properly. Loot was their only pension. When you condition people to see violence as salary, don't be surprised when their accounting books are written in blood. Cities taken by storm often had to endure reconstruction, though that word deserves quotation marks. Reconstruction meant rebuilding the walls first, not the homes, and it meant raising taxes to fund them. Survivors were forced into labour gangs, hauling stone and timber under guard. Imagine working on the wall that once shielded you, now under the supervision of the very army that tore it down. It is almost comical in its cruelty, like being forced to reassemble the lock on the cell door that had just been broken to drag you out. And when famine came, as it inevitably did after every long siege, those same survivors often died while the conquerors dined in the commandeered halls. History tends to call this period recovery. Recovery, in this sense, meant recovering the capacity to be taxed and exploited again. There was also the propaganda machine, crude but effective. Victors commissioned monks or scribes to write glowing accounts of their just war. Chroniclers emphasized divine favor, omens, and heroic speeches, carefully omitting the bodies still rotting in the streets. Cities became cautionary tales. morality plays performed on parchment to frighten other towns into obedience. A burned-out ruin was recast as a symbol of God's will, and the slaughter of thousands became a footnote to a story about faith and destiny. And here's the criticism worth hammering home. Medieval rulers were masters at laundering atrocity into narrative. The sword was bad enough, but the quill added insult to injury. One might survive a siege, but good luck surviving the official version of events. And yet, not everything was despair. Human beings have a stubborn instinct to adapt, even in the face of humiliation. Survivors rebuilt markets, repaired churches, replanted fields. Children played in streets where corpses had once lain. Festivals returned, though smaller, quieter, and under watchful eyes. Life did continue, albeit warped. For many, the memory of the siege was carried in silence, in the way people avoided certain streets or whispered about ghosts in burned-out towers. Trauma was not studied or discussed. It was endured. And endurance, again, was the defining word. A medieval city was like a tree struck by lightning, half scorched, half living, stubbornly growing around its wound. Thomas, the soldier who had once thought only of loot, might return home years later with nothing but scars and a few coins. He would tell stories of victory in taverns, but leave out the details of starvation, disease, and meaningless slaughter. Marjorie, if she survived long enough, would never tell her story. History rarely cared about the Marjories of the world. But in their silence lay the true cost of siege warfare, the unrecorded suffering of countless ordinary people. In the end, what did victory mean? It meant one ruler gained a city and another lost it. It meant maps were redrawn, banners swapped, taxes redirected. For the common people, victory meant little more than a different badge on the men who collected their grain. The endurance test had not ended, it had merely shifted forms. Survival during the siege was followed by survival under occupation, survival through famine, survival in silence. The human body and spirit proved astonishingly resilient, but resilience is not the same as peace. And so, the story of a siege never really ended at the breach. Its shadow lingered in ruins, in chronicles, and in the bones beneath the earth. If the assault was the climax, the aftermath was the haunting coda. Cities carried that weight for centuries, and we centuries later still marvel at their endurance without always acknowledging the cruelty of the test they endured. When the last stone was hauled back into place, when the ashes of burned houses were swept aside, and when the chronicles of noble victories were inked and bound, the siege seemed, at least on paper, complete. But history is less about what was written than about what was endured, and the endurance of medieval people after a siege tells us more about their world than any victorious king's charter or bishop's sermon. The aftermath was not the silence of peace, it was the hum of exhaustion, the sound of people too drained to resist but too stubborn to vanish. That, more than the siege engines or the flaming arrows, was the true endurance test. Let us be frank, medieval people did not get therapy sessions, trauma workshops, or commemorative statues. They got plague outbreaks, tax collectors, and the privilege of rebuilding walls for the very Lord who had failed them in the first place. Imagine Marjorie, our ordinary survivor, standing barefoot in the rubble, her children tugging at her sleeve. Does she think of politics? No. She thinks of bread. She thinks of finding a safe roof before winter crushes her like the siege never did. And yet, historians have a bad habit of skipping over her story. Chronicles loved knights and kings, not starving widows. The irony is brutal. The people who suffered most are the ones least remembered. It's almost as if medieval history was written not as a record, but as a convenient advertisement for whichever elite survived. The conquerors certainly knew the value of spectacle. Triumphal processions celebrated the new order. Parades of prisoners emphasized submission, and churches rang bells as if divine will had personally directed every catapult stone. The new rulers spoke the language of renewal, but their renewal meant little more than installing their bureaucrats and squeezing coin from the survivors. A famine following a siege was practically guaranteed, yet tax demands rarely shrank. It takes a special kind of cruelty to demand levies from people whose fields are still smouldering. But medieval rulers excelled in that cruelty. They even managed to sanctify it, calling it restoring balance. Balance in this sense meant balancing the ruler's coffers on the backs of the already broken. Meanwhile, soldiers like Thomas, whose pockets jingled with stolen trinkets, had already begun their slow slide back into poverty. Loot does not last, and neither does the euphoria of victory. Many veterans returned home with nothing but bad joints, missing teeth, and vague memories of glory that tavern listeners pretended to care about. Siege warfare promised them riches, but usually delivered disillusionment. A soldier might leave with a chalice ripped from a church, only to sell it for cheap wine and be left with a hangover instead of a fortune. The real wealth was always siphoned upward, carried to castles and treasuries, while the foot soldiers became footnotes. History books praised generals. The men who carried ladders under arrow fire were rewarded with silence. But perhaps the darkest irony was how quickly societies normalized the destruction. A year after a siege, life went on. Markets reopened, bells tolled, weddings were held. The ruins were folded into daily life like scars ignored beneath a cloak. Children grew up playing among broken walls, never knowing their city without them. And yet, collective memory lingered in subtle ways. Families avoided speaking of the siege at dinner, but every whispered rumour, every rebuilt shrine, every burned field was a reminder. Trauma became part of the landscape. We may criticise medieval people for their superstition, but it was one of the few outlets available to them. Ghost stories and tales of divine punishment allowed survivors to make sense of suffering in a way official chronicles never could. What strikes me most, and what deserves criticism, is how modern readers often romanticize this cycle. We talk of resilience as if it were a heroic badge, but resilience is just another word for forced survival under conditions no human being should endure. The people of a besieged city were not stoic heroes by choice. They were prisoners of circumstance. To praise their resilience without condemning the system that made it necessary is like applauding a drowning man for treading water. Yes, it's impressive that he stayed afloat, but perhaps we should ask why he was thrown into the river in the first place. Still, there is something profoundly human about the way communities rebuilt. In the shadows of ruins, bakeries reopened, churches rang bells again, and laughter cautiously returned to streets. Even if it was nervous laughter, even if it was laughter muffled by hunger, it existed. And that, perhaps, is the real endurance test, continuing to live in spite of cruelty, not because of it. The endurance of medieval towns was not a triumph of rulers or armies. It was the persistence of ordinary people who refused to vanish, who grew crops again, who sang hymns again, who buried their dead and went on. Thomas, the soldier, and Marjorie, the survivor, fade into that background, their names lost to time. But their presence echoes in every ruined tower, in every rebuilt wall, in every anonymous bone unearthed by archaeologists centuries later. They remind us that the medieval siege was not a chapter neatly closed with victory, but a wound carried forward. The final insult is how little their suffering mattered to the rulers who claimed victory. Kings died and were replaced, maps changed, castles rose and fell. But for the people who endured sieges, the memory never left. And that is the conclusion we should carry. Medieval sieges were not just battles. They were entire social earthquakes, reshaping families, economies, and memories. They were endurance tests in every sense, physical, psychological, spiritual. Some passed and lived, some failed and died, but none emerged unchanged. If history insists on calling them victories, we should be bold enough to call them what they were: prolonged ordeals that wrung humanity through the grinder of power. So, as you drift off to sleep with these images in mind, the broken walls, the smouldering fields, the hollow-eyed survivors, remember that endurance is not glamorous. It is simply survival stretched thin. And maybe, just maybe, we can criticize a past that demanded so much suffering just to preserve the vanity of lords and kings. The siege may have ended, but the test of endurance never really did. And so, dear listener, we close the book on another uneasy chapter of the medieval world. You've wandered with me through rubble and banquet halls, through plague pits and marketplaces, through the endless tug-of-war between survival and spectacle. If there's one thing history never fails to teach, it's that ordinary people bore the heaviest burdens while elites claimed the glory. That hasn't changed much, has it? The settings are different, the costumes updated, but the pattern remains suspiciously familiar. Perhaps that's why these stories matter. Not because we enjoy tales of misery, though you must admit there's something darkly fascinating about them, but because they remind us how easily suffering can be normalized and how quickly memory bends toward the powerful. The chronicles may speak of kings, yet the truth lingers in the cracks, in the silence of survivors who had no parchment, no ink, and no reason to glorify their pain. So, as you drift into sleep, let the past murmur its caution. Walls crumble, rulers fall, but human endurance, messy, stubborn, uncelebrated, carries on. Tomorrow, you'll wake in a world that pretends to be wiser than the Middle Ages, though it still trips over the same mistakes. History, it seems, is less of a lesson and more of a loop. This has been The Drowsy Historian. Thank you for keeping me company in the candlelight of the past. Sleep well, dream darkly, and remember, if history makes you uncomfortable, it's probably because it's doing its job.